Hello players and GMs, I am Reese, and welcome to the first video in Jetpack 7's Solving D&D series. Now let me preface by saying that I love D&D. I've played a lot of D&D, I've run a lot of D&D, and I will continue to play and run D&D probably for the rest of my life. But there are problems that I run into while I'm playing or while I'm trying to play that I still run into today. So in the Solving D&D series, we are going to take a look at what are, in my opinion, the 5 biggest problems in Dungeons and Dragons. So for this very first video, we are just going to take a look at what are those 5 problems. And then in later videos, we'll take a look much deeper into those problems individually and figure out how we can solve them. Some of them have more general solutions, other ones you kind of have to just get down into the nitty-gritty and really crunch some numbers. But let's go ahead and get started by looking at what are the 5 biggest problems in D&D. Number 5, lack of rules for out of combat. As we know, Dungeons & Dragons in all of its editions, not just in 5e, focuses largely on in-combat rules because that's where most of it comes in. That's where you're going to be seeing most of the action in Dungeons & Dragons. It just makes sense. But if you're like me, you play with a bunch of people who really enjoy the role-playing aspect. So that means a lot of the time you find yourselves in a position where you need to be able to do out-of-combat stuff. And if you're GMing it, sometimes that can become difficult. I currently am running an urban setting, very low combat campaign, and let me tell you, it's hard. There are a lot of situations where I have found myself just kind of having to sit and think about what the ruling should be or how the NPCs would react or how certain decisions that my players make would affect the world. And even though I consider myself an experienced GM who's pretty good at rolling with the punches, there are occasionally times when I wish I had sort of a reference. I wish I had something to go off of that someone more experienced than myself had already written. For example, let's say that your party is sneaking through the secret lair of some big bad villain. How often do they need to make checks? What kind of actions can they take while they're in there that would affect the stealth check? What exactly is the ruling on everything that's happening? Social encounters. When are checks even needed? Can a player just talk their way through a situation without making any checks, or is there always a check required, even if the thing that they're arguing is perfectly logical and makes sense? It's kind of up in the air. And then there's Charm Person. And if you've ever run a game where a player succeeds in charming an NPC, then you know the struggle here. Charm Person has this really miraculous way of exposing all of the gray area in out-of-combat rulings, because suddenly you now have to roleplay a creature that used to be hostile or neutral to a player character as now friendly to that player character. Quick hypothetical. The party is investigating the front for a thieves guild. It's run as a business, we'll say. So they go into this business, they knock on the door, and the person who opens the door knows immediately that this is a group of individuals investigating the thieves guild. So that NPC is hostile to the party. One of the party members casts Charm Person, the person fails, so now they're friendly to the party. How do they react? Do they just let them in, or do they just politely kind of usher them away? Now they're not trying to fight them, they're just like, hey, you can't be here. So obviously, there is a lot of gray area in out-of-combat situations that, for me as a GM, get pretty difficult to operate sometimes. Number 4, item costs and economy. This is the one that I have struggled with the absolute most. If I had to pick one problem that is my biggest issue as a GM, then this is definitively it. If you are running a campaign where the adventurers aren't just running around in the woods and living the freest lifestyle ever, then this kind of stuff does come into account pretty regularly. What is the cost of living in D&D? How much are you paying to have a house? How much are you paying to stay in an inn every night for food, for drinks? There are so many things that just don't get covered or are very briefly mentioned in the DM screen or something like that. And if you aren't able to keep it consistent, then it can cause some problems, because then you get into the problem of items, specifically magic items. 5e has all these awesome magic items that are conveniently laid out into these awesome tables, but there is not a single price given. Now there is this one small chart in the DMG that gives you a wide range of prices based on the item's rarity. But let's just talk about this chart for a second. So to start off, each of the items are separated into either common, uncommon, rare, very rare, or legendary. Common items range anywhere from 50 to 100 gold, which is pretty reasonable. That's something that we can actually wrap our head around. That's anything from a first level spell scroll to a potion of healing. Uncommon items range anywhere from 100 to 500 gold, which is still relatively reasonable. That's anything from a bag of holding to a javelin of lightning. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit looser. Rare items can range anywhere from 500 gold to 5,000 gold. So there is a 4,500 gold difference between items that are, for some reason, ranked at the same level of rarity. So you're supposed to be able to just look at this and figure out where they fit in that 4,500 gold range. And it doesn't get any better at very rare, which range from 5,000 gold to 50,000 gold. So now we've got a 45,000 gold range. Again, all of those items listed at the exact same rarity. And then legendary items make sure to keep things very loose, with items ranging anywhere from 50,000 gold to infinity, I guess. Then we get into crafting new items, selling the items to vendors in the game. Does anyone actually have that much gold other than the adventurers? It's all a crapshoot, and I think that is one part of the game that is definitely lacking in a little bit of clarity. Number 3, vague rules. Now, I think this one can be considered also a good thing about 5th edition, but it can also cause a good number of problems. So 5th edition is very DM reliant. What that means is that it relies heavily on the GM to make the calls and decide how things should be ruled in that moment. And for some people, that might be an awesome thing. That might be exactly what they want. A lot of people really want to just be able to run the game how they want to run the game, not being too beholden to a specific rule set. However, some people want to play in a game that is very beholden to a rule set because it makes it feel more consistent, makes it feel more fair. No matter how good of a GM they are, people are going to make mistakes. And when you're making up a ruling on the spot, it's going to interfere with a bit of consistency, and it's going to be difficult to maintain that throughout the campaign. One of the simplest examples is one of the most core aspects of 5th edition, advantage and disadvantage. When are they justified? The DMG basically just says whenever you want, and it gives you a couple examples of hypothetical situations that it might be justified in, but there's also the idea of lowering the DC, which is also something that you just kind of determine in your head as you go. And then there are a couple rules that are written in the book, but frankly just don't give specifics. Blind sight is one of those. It essentially just says that a creature with blind sight can sense other creatures without the use of their sight. So are they using sonar, or do they just have a really good nose, or are they just kind of sensing the vibes of the room a little bit? We really don't know. And that would make a difference, especially if they're seeing with sound instead and then their character gets deafened. Another rule is surprise. Surprise is technically stated as a condition. A surprised creature cannot take actions or move during their turn, and then at the end of their turn, they're no longer surprised. Seems pretty straightforward. You do an initiative order and everything like that. However, let's say that your party is approaching a group of monsters, but your rogue sneaks off to the side. The rogue is undetected by those monsters, but the party is engaging them in the front. So now, all those monsters are surprised by the rogue, but not by the party. How do you rule that? How are the monsters now under the surprised condition while also not being surprised as well? Number 2, combat. Combat. Ugh. Combat is so crucial to D&D, but it is so often also the worst part of any campaign. I love combat. Let me clarify. I love good combat. I hate bad combat. Bad combat is slow and repetitious. People move, then they attack, then they get attacked, then they move, then they attack, then they get attacked, and that just happens over and over and over again until one group or the other is dead. More times than not, it's the monsters. Not to mention, if you're playing D&D with a bunch of people who play a lot, like I do, then the monsters start to get predictable. People know what these monsters are. You can't cover them up anymore. And God forbid you're playing a martial class in a boring combat encounter because you just run forward and hit things, and that's it. That's all you do every single turn. 5th edition modules also have a tendency to rely on random encounters, and random encounters are one of my least favorite things in the entire game. I absolutely despise random encounter tables. I think they're handy and I think they're fine, but if they are overused, they are absolutely dreadful. Random encounters, to me, are the D&D equivalent of anime filler. They're just there to fill the space if you have nothing else to put there. And yet, they are in a lot of modules. And that encourages people to put them in a lot of their campaigns. And I really, really wish that was not the case because it just adds to the repetitious nature of combat. And finally, number 1. What is the biggest problem in Dungeons and Dragons? All 4 of them so far have been inside the game, but the biggest problem is actually outside of the game. And I think every player and GM will agree with me when they hear this. The biggest problem in D&D is getting people to freaking play and getting them to keep playing. So many D&D campaigns I've started or played in have begun and been played regularly and then gotten to level 5 and fizzled out. It has gotten so common that at this point, I just call it the D&D problem. Most campaigns will get started, everyone will be super excited, everyone will be happy to play, they'll be talking about their characters, and then it gets to level 5, get that text. You know the one I'm talking about. Hey, I can't make it this week. Any way we could move to next week? You used to get together every week, and then you start getting together every other week, and then you only get together once a month, and then you kind of stop getting together, and then you occasionally message each other back and forth about how much you miss the group, and then the campaign dies, an untimely, unfortunate, silent, lonely death. It is easy to get interest into a campaign, but it is very, very difficult to maintain it. Which is normal and perfectly understandable because everyone has different priorities. People have jobs, they need to sleep, they have different schedules oftentimes, so it's very, very difficult to get people to meet up at all, not to mention for a few hours at the same time every single week. And so, due to all of those things coming together, people will start playing D&D and then they just kind of stop. And I've heard about this happening many, many times with many, many different groups of people. It's happened to me a few times, and I think it is definitively the biggest problem with D&D by far. So those are, in my opinion, the top 5 biggest problems with D&D. Tell me in the comments below if you think I missed anything, because I would love to make a video about whatever you all think are the biggest problems out there as well. Also, if you liked this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel. It helps us out so much. So thank you all very, very much for watching. Stay tuned for next week's video, and we'll see you around.